Hello everyone, and thank you once again, Jane Eyre Adaptation Comparison fans, for patiently waiting for this. Last time we examined how 9 major adaptations of Jane Eyre interpreted the scene in which Rochester asks Jane to marry him. Today we're going to discuss how they adapted what I'm calling the engagement period, the month between the proposal and the wedding, which Charlotte Brontë writes about in chapters 24 and 25. That's 2 whole chapters, which works out to about 30 pages in my copy of the book, which is why this video is so long, even though I hoped it would be short. Chapter 24 essentially includes 5 main events. Number 1, Jane has a talk with Rochester, who declares his intention to A. marry her within a month, B. shower her with jewels and a new wardrobe, and C. once they're married, take her on a tour of Europe. Number 2, Mrs. Fairfax privately expresses her concerns about the marriage. She's disturbed by the differences in status, wealth, and age. When she asks, "Is it really for love that he's marrying you?" Jane gets upset, asking if she's such a monster that he couldn't possibly love her. Mrs. Fairfax warns that she's naive where men are concerned, therefore she should be cautious. Number 3, Rochester takes Jane shopping in town, bringing Adele along at Jane's request. Jane finds this excursion stressful thanks to Rochester's overbearing generosity. She realizes that she doesn't like being totally financially dependent. She doesn't want to be kept. She doesn't want to be dressed up like a doll and smothered with riches. She's just plain Jane Eyre. Decked out in silks and diamonds, she'd be at risk of losing her identity. Number 4, Jane eventually puts her foot down and insists on maintaining her usual modest style. She also insists that they maintain the same daily routine until the wedding. That includes keeping Rochester at a safe, unromantic distance, which frustrates him, but makes her, and Mrs. Fairfax incidentally, feel better. Number 5, Jane's desire for some financial independence prompts her to write to her uncle in Madeira, telling him of her upcoming nuptials. Chapter 24 starts off positively with Jane's joy and incredulity the morning after the proposal. It's like the calm before the storm. Jane and Rochester are very playful with each other. He calls her a number of absurd names. His pale little elf, his mustard seed, an angel, a sprite, a salamander, a thing. By the way, one of the funniest moments, I think, occurs when Rochester mistakes the color of her eyes. Jane doesn't correct him, but kind of shares an eye roll with the reader. "Is this my pale little elf? Is this my mustard seed? This little sunny-faced girl with a dimpled cheek and rosy lips, the satin-smooth hazel hair and the radiant hazel eyes?" I had green eyes, reader, but you must excuse the mistake. For him they were new-dyed, I suppose. Jane makes a prediction, based on books she's read, that Rochester's love for her will fizzle out in 6 months, but Rochester swears that will never happen. It's not clear if she's making this comment in jest, or if she's voicing a genuine concern. Jane also says there's something she's been curious about. Immediately, Rochester tenses up. If you know the story, you know why. But when she asks why he made her think that he loved Blanche Ingram, he relaxes and says, "Oh, is that all?" I must say, I find Rochester less appealing in this section of the story. He's pushy, kind of arrogant and possessive, and dismissive of Jane's desires for modesty and routine. While the fact that he wants to give her so much to make up for what she never had and he feels she's entitled to is commendable, it's not great when he won't listen to her and when he seems to have no clue that the things he chooses for her don't match her taste and make her uncomfortable. Chapter 24 is kind of like the courtship they never had, and Jane is determined to let him know what he's in for. She wants to be sensible, not sentimental, so she keeps the more physically demonstrative Rochester at bay. This irritates him, but he also kind of likes it. I think they both like the way she's exerting power over him, and it's an interesting dynamic. Chapter 25 jumps ahead to the day before the wedding, and the feeling of impending doom intensifies. Rochester's away on business, and Jane waits anxiously for his return. When he finally gets back, she tells him 3 things that happened. First, she had a dream that she was walking down a road carrying a small child, trying to catch up to Rochester, but he kept getting further away. Second, she had another dream that Thornfield stood in ruins, and she, still carrying the child, stumbled around the wreckage and fell off a wall. Then she woke to a bright light, which turned out to be candlelight, and saw someone standing in her bedroom, looking at the wedding dress. At first she thought it was Sophie, one of the servants, until she realized it was someone she'd never seen before. The woman took the extravagant veil Rochester had sent from London and put it on her own head briefly before tearing it in two. Then she came to Jane's bedside and hovered so close that Jane, for the second time in her life, fainted. When Jane asks Rochester who the woman was, he tells her that she was just another bad dream. That's when Jane reveals that the next morning she found the two torn pieces of veil lying on her floor. Rochester is alarmed, but he quickly recovers, telling Jane it was just Grace Poole again. When Jane asks why he keeps Grace Poole in the house, he says, "When we have been married a year and a day, I will tell you, but not now." Jane doesn't argue with this, amazingly. I would say, you tell me now, or we're not getting married at all. I'm not having any of this, oh, I'll tell you later when it's too late to escape nonsense. But even though Jane isn't really satisfied, she acts like she is. Rochester advises her to sleep in Adele's room and lock the door, and she does, though she doesn't sleep that night. Such is her disturbed mental state the night before the wedding. Now, it's taken me however many minutes to explain what happens in this section, which is more time than some of the adaptations spend on it. As far as the identity of the woman who tears the veil goes, those of you who are familiar with the story already know, so you don't need me to tell you. Those of you who happen to be watching this video who don't already know, my approach to this series has always been, with one or two exceptions, to go through the book as it happens. At this point in the book, Jane doesn't know who the woman is, so I have kept that under wraps, and I'm not going to explain it just yet, but it'll be revealed in the next episode. Now forget everything I just said for a minute, because we're going to take a look at what the 1934 version does here, which has nothing in common with what's in the book. Following the proposal, we see Rochester, Jane, and Mrs. Fairfax taking tea with the minister. Rochester announces they'll be getting married as soon as his solicitor returns from London with an important legal document. We cut away to this clumsily edited scene with Grace Poole, who then interrupts the visit only to rush back out again when Rochester questions her. She says there's nothing wrong, when clearly there is, and then, whoop, who's that wandering in? But we're not ready for her yet. Obviously, they didn't follow the book, but even apart from that, this is very abrupt and choppy and just not great. The 1944 version also doesn't try too hard to stick with the book here, but it gives us a little more. Rochester boisterously cancels Adele's lessons. I do appreciate that they kept his fanciful explanation that he's going to take Mademoiselle to the moon and keep her in a cave. He takes Jane and Adele shopping and orders a plethora of fabrics, steamrolling over Jane's good-natured protestations, and nonchalantly dismisses a fortune-teller. The last thing we see before the wedding is an ominous shot of a woman in a tower looking down, presumably, at the distant church where the ceremony's taking place. The 1970 version also keeps this section brief, having just 2 short scenes. In the first one, Rochester walks with Jane, now attired in a sunny gingham gown, to Ferndean Manor, his other house a short distance away from Thornfield. He plans for them to live there when they're not traveling abroad. This version makes an interesting choice, bypassing most things the other adaptations include. Instead, they have the dialogue where Jane teases him about her expectations for their marriage, that after a while he'll turn cool toward her and she'll have a hard time making him happy, until eventually he grows to like her again. In response, he gives her a flower. In the other scene, finally we get to see Jane's ghostly visitor, who puts on the veil and preens in the mirror until Jane stirs in her sleep. The veil is tossed to the floor as the woman dashes away. Note the veil is not torn in two. Thus ends the section. 1973. Last time I mentioned that the morning after the proposal, Adele comes in to wake Jane with news of the chestnut tree being struck by lightning. That's followed by Jane's scene with Rochester, a man clearly in love with his new fiancée. I always think of this scene as having a lot of kissing. It doesn't really. Rochester kisses her only 3 times, but they're enthusiastic kisses. The book's dialogue isn't reproduced verbatim, but the script's edits make it flow smoother. Jane and Rochester's disagreement over the jewels is light and played mostly for, well, not exactly played for laughs, but played for smiles. If Jane is ever really bothered by the subject, she doesn't show it, and this version omits the frustrating shopping trip. In this first scene of them as a couple, we already see some role reversal. Jane is more assertive with Rochester than before, not afraid to interrogate and tease and criticize him. He takes this with a false front of outrage. I think he even enjoys it when she rakes him over the coals. There are times in this scene when I just have to say, man, I love Jason's Rochester. We do get to see Jane writing to her uncle in Madeira, but gone is Mrs. Fairfax's warning. Whatever Rochester told her off-screen must have convinced her that all was well. The next time we see her, she's cheerfully fitting Jane for a very ugly wedding gown and telling her she looks almost pretty. The scene at night is well done. We watch Jane's visitor come in. She chuckles at first when she sees Jane sleeping, but when she parts her hair for a better look, she lets out a troubled whimper. First, she holds up the wedding gown, but she's distressed by the sight of herself in the mirror and drops it. The veil in this one was established as a Rochester family heirloom, worn by his mother and grandmother. It's unclear if it's the veil or Jane's voice that upsets her, but she tears up the veil with an angry cry. After Jane faints, she puts out the candle with her fingers and makes her exit with a burst of mad laughter, a suggestion to me of pyromania. In the last scene before the wedding, Jane tells Rochester about her dreams and the woman she saw. Rochester seems unsure of how to react. He's alarmed, but doesn't want to confirm her fears by dwelling on them. He wants her to be safe, but he's also eager to change the subject, and ultimately, he succeeds in doing so. A few of these adaptations show Jane waking up the morning after the proposal. 1983 switches things up by starting the day from the alternate perspective, with Rochester impatiently pacing around. He looks annoyed until Jane, wearing a light-colored dress, comes flying down the stairs and into his arms. Timothy Dalton is the only Rochester who has to pull off calling Jane his mustard seed. I can't make up my mind if I think this pet name is ridiculous or endearing, but watching these two, I'm inclined to think it's absolutely adorable. Jane's protests against the jewels are so heartfelt that he reluctantly gives in to her pleas. For the second time that morning, Rochester seems like he might be on the verge of a bad mood, but Jane pulls him out of it. Like in 73, we see Jane naturally assuming a more dominant role with him. She's able to quiet his moods, deflect his anger, get him to change direction, and she can tease him in a way that no one else would get away with. I love the staging here, when Jane's like, okay, I didn't let you give me the jewels, but you can give me an answer to this question. She mischievously circles his desk and stands behind him, and I like how nervous he looks for that split second when he fears she's going to ask about something else. You can practically see the wheels turning, the lie starting to form. Jane's the one who breaks the news to Mrs. Fairfax. She takes the older woman's astonishment cheerfully, but when Mrs. Fairfax questions Rochester's motives, Jane firmly puts her down. In the next scene, the strange woman comes in Jane's room, apparently going straight to where the veil is kept. I like how Jane whispers, "Sophie?" Like she knows very well that isn't Sophie. The woman gazes at herself with the veil in the mirror, then yanks it off, tearing it and stomping on it. When she gets in Jane's face, we get a close-up of her menacing expression. Jane's frustrated when Rochester acts like he doesn't believe her tale, but there's no question he's genuinely upset that harm might have come to her, so his reaction is a little contradictory. Rochester uses his powers of persuasion and authority to try to convince her she saw Grace Poole again, and loses his temper when she asks the obvious question, why does he still keep her at the house? Immediately sorry, he comes back, kissing her by way of apology. And that's when, once again, Timothy Dalton makes a royal mess of Zela Clark's hair. Honestly, if I were the actors or the director, I'd want another take, but that would probably mean sending her back to hair and makeup for about an hour. And anyway, there's something so charming and realistic about it, especially the way they both laugh. In the 1996 version, the engagement period consists of just one scene, the conversation between Jane and Mrs. Fairfax. I like how Charlotte Gainsbourg's Jane responds in this scene, concealing her deeper feelings so as not to offend the older woman who's clearly been shaken up by the news. And she stands up for herself without getting too angry or too defensive. But the focus is really on Mrs. Fairfax. Joan Plowright portrays the housekeeper as a somewhat frail, uncertain woman whose speech always seems to waver, not the bustling, chatty type we see in so many other versions. Mrs. Fairfax's warning is delivered more tactfully in this version, I think. She's more concerned than shocked, and says she regrets that she didn't warn Jane away sooner. There's a suggestion that it's more than just the impropriety or unevenness of the match that worries and upsets her, which makes me wonder, how much do you know, Mrs. Fairfax? The 1997 version dwells longer on the engagement period than any of the other feature film-length adaptations. Jane wakes with a start and rushes downstairs, afraid she's dreamed the whole thing. Rochester joins her and Mrs. Fairfax, confirming the reality while Mrs. Fairfax is distracted with the dog. What gets me, though, is that he doesn't let anyone else in on the secret. He announces they're going shopping, and that's it. Poor Mrs. Fairfax is left alone, shaken and confused. You should at least tell your housekeeper you're getting married. In town, they happen to run into Blanche Ingram, and he does tell her. Kind of rubs it in her face, actually, and Jane looks a little smug too, although that could just be a patient, serene expression. Blanche tries the mean girl act, but doesn't get the desired result, so she introduces the guy hovering in the background, an older man with a title who she's latched onto. That's followed by a scene of Jane and Rochester quibbling over material for the veil. I do like it when she puts her foot down. He buys both the ornate and the simple veil, a convenient compromise since she's gonna need the backup. I confess this scene, which is supposed to be creepy, does make me laugh a bit. Jane's uninvited visitor puts on the veil and dances in place for a moment, I think she's dancing, until Jane asks who's in the room. Then the veil is ripped in half and she leaves, accompanied by a weird sizzling sound effect. Next scene, Jane's trying to tell Rochester about the veil, and he's just like, "How do you like my new waistcoat? I told you you've got to keep your door locked with Grace Poole around. Look at this thing I got you." It's annoying. Jane calls him on it, so Rochester explains that if he throws Grace out, she'll end up in an asylum, and he doesn't want to do that to her. He insists that all will be taken care of, there's no need to worry, we'll be miles away soon enough, and anyway, now you get to wear the simple veil you wanted. Thus, he coaxes a smile out of her before unveiling her present, a glass dome music box, and they dance like the two mechanical figures. It's different. Okay, miniseries number 3, the 2006 version. How do they handle this? Assuming this is the next morning, Jane must have been too deliriously happy to even get ready for bed the night before. Still in yesterday's clothes, she marvels at herself in the mirror for a second and twirls like a little girl. Then, donning a light summer gown, she joins Mrs. Fairfax, who proceeds to dump a bucket of water over her. Figuratively, of course. Mrs. Fairfax is pretty harsh in her criticism, perturbed that Jane could forsake her naturally level-headed good sense. She stops just short of calling her a fool. Jane walks out on the conversation, going to Rochester, who cuddles her and smooths her ruffled feathers, assuring her that Mrs. Fairfax doesn't know them, therefore she can't possibly understand their feelings. Unlike in the 73 and 83 miniseries, I don't see the same dynamic shift between these two characters now that they're in a relationship. That's because they were already so comfortable and friendly and informal with each other. In this scene, Rochester refers to himself as the servant and Jane as the mistress, which reiterates that role reversal, but it's just solidifying something that was already in place. The change is that they can be more open and more physical, and obviously they'll reach 100% capacity on that point when they're married. Personally, I prefer these interpretations where Jane has the freedom to assert herself and express her opinions, and she doesn't let Rochester badger her, and she actually manages to wrap him around her finger. It's much more palatable, and more faithful to the book, than just showing Jane get swept along with Rochester's whirlwind of prenuptial activities. Anyway, Mrs. Fairfax's qualms cast aside, things get a lot more fun. He turns cranky when Jane goes back to calling him Sir and Mr. Rochester, and when she insists on continuing her routine as usual, and when she insists that Adele come to town with them, and when she refuses to let him hold her hand in the carriage, and when she puts Adele between them as a buffer. It's all light and playful, and I don't know, maybe I'm speaking for myself, but I think one of the best things about the 2006 version is when Toby Stephens shows this delightfully cantankerous and cheeky side of Rochester. All the Rochesters who play up that characteristic are so much more enjoyable. Jane follows Rochester in the shop, quietly correcting and reducing his excessive orders, and he's humbled when Adele knows better than he what suits Jane's taste. We see Jane writing to her uncle in Madeira, also promising Adele that she'll be placed in a good school, and you know Jane will do everything she can to keep that promise. This is the only version to depict Jane's nightmares, though it's not exactly what's described in the book. I'm not sure how I feel about Blanche showing up there. It implies that Blanche, who's definitely no longer a threat at this point, is still subconsciously weighing on Jane's mind. This version doesn't show us the entire veil scene either, which is odd. Jane wakes with a start to a candle in her face. Blinded, she can't see who holds it. The scene then jumps ahead to the next day, where Jane anxiously awaits Rochester's return and goes to meet him. She brings him to a room where the veil, now torn, lies on the bed. Rochester does pretty well at keeping his cool. He refers to her dream about Thornfield in ruins, which we didn't actually see in that dream sequence, and puts these things down to anxiety about the drastic changes coming in her life. But she insists she's very happy, looking forward to their union. And that's it. They don't really have a disagreement about Grace Poole. He makes no sketchy year-and-a-day promise. He doesn't caution her to spend the night with Adele. So I find the last section of this engagement period a little anticlimactic. What the 2011 version does with this scene is a little complicated to evaluate. That's because there's the footage we have, and then there's the footage that actually made it into the movie. The day after the proposal, Jane and Mrs. Fairfax observe the broken tree while Mrs. Fairfax pours out her doubts and warnings. For the most part, Jane stands and takes it. If Mrs. Fairfax's words offend her, she doesn't bite back. In the next scene, Jane reveals that Mrs. Fairfax's words did get to her. She walks out to meet Rochester, and I gotta say, I know they tried to make Jane Eyre with nothing to say a thing, but it strikes me as an incongruous comment given how silent this Jane typically is. For a bride-to-be, Jane doesn't seem happy, and referring to Rochester as phantom-like clues us into her tenuous mindset, that perhaps she feels this whole thing is unreal and the illusion will end at any moment. Fortunately, things brighten up again when they switch over to a cheerful engagement montage of Rochester and Jane just hanging out together and flirting against some beautiful backdrops. For once, everything's sunshine and smiles, and one of the most charming moments in the entire film, I think, is Jane trying to make a sketch of Rochester while he keeps trying to steal her sketchbook. It's so nice to hear them laugh for a change. If you're watching the film, that's it. The next scene is Jane putting on her wedding gown. But if you check out the deleted scenes, you'll find there's more. First, we follow Grace Poole, I think it's her, through an attic or abandoned wing where there's a lot of dusty old furniture and things. A wardrobe swings open and we see a white dress hanging in there. Cut to Jane's room at night. She wakes, and in one of the spookiest interpretations of this scene, we watch a woman go through Jane's things wearing the veil. When she turns around to look at Jane, she pulls the veil tight across her face, like she's suffocating or strangling herself, and then she tears it apart with her fingers, the hole in the veil allowing her to breathe freely. Rather than the wild, ugly-looking woman we've caught glimpses of in other versions, this is a younger, more attractive woman. She approaches Jane and actually gets on top of her in the bed, humming in her ear. Jane squirms to get away, and then she wakes up. At first it seems it was just a dream, until she sees the veil on the floor. In the next scene, Rochester tries to convince her she was at least partially dreaming, but Jane sticks to her guns, refusing to be told what she knows isn't true. So Rochester promises to tell her what's going on, after they've been married a year and a day. Like so many of the deleted scenes from this version, this should have been kept in. It would have made the story more cohesive, and I would have liked it better. As it is, unless someday they release a director's cut with the good deleted scenes put back in, these two scenes officially are not part of the film, and that's too bad. Final thoughts: there's a lot of disparity among the adaptations here. The content, the mood, the length of time spent on the engagement period. As I said, I prefer it when an adaptation takes some time to show Jane and Rochester interacting with each other. I think it's important to see what they're like together at this in-between point, when they're no longer held back by unspoken feelings, but she's still an unmarried woman and his employee. And I like to see them disagreeing with each other. Not that I like to watch an argument, but I think it's important to see how they handle conflict, especially how Jane handles Rochester in a conflict. And, in my opinion, it's also imperative that the veil scene be included. So, 1934, 1944, 1996, and yes, 2011 are at a disadvantage here because they leave it out. Alright, I think I touched on pretty much everything I wanted to mention. This adaptation comparison is much longer than I expected it would be. I hope you enjoyed it though, and I hope that the next episode, will be along shortly. I have already started working on it, so that'll be fun. It's the wedding. Let me know what you think of the engagement period and the various adaptations of it in the comments below, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.